screen. So and we will get
Okay.
the show on the road here. So I have opened the webinar. So I'm going to give a minute or two for everybody just to kind of get into the room. So hello to everyone that is joining us now. You are being recorded, and you are here with Julian Barnes, Elizabeth Finch, we will be discussing. Seth Lerer will be his interlocutor who will be doing the interview. And thank you all for joining us. Elena, take it away for your customers.
Hi, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time. I know you're all busy and this is noon on a Wednesday, so hopefully it's a treat and you're, having a nice break right now. He can't see you eating, so enjoy your lunch if this is what this is for you. I just want to thank everyone for continued support, and we're just, oh my dog, they're trimming trees by my
The beauty of life.
Just want to thank everyone for supporting independent bookstores, and Books Inc. is so happy to partner with these other fellow booksellers. Support your indies and buy some books.
Excellent. Thanks, Elena. And on behalf of the other bookstores, we have Book Passage, we have Skylight and Copperfields who's joining us along with Warwick. So thank you all. I will be putting in the link how to order this wonderful book from Warwick's. If the other bookstores are here with us, go ahead and pop that in the chat from your store. If you're not, if I don't see it, I'll try and put your store link in there too, if possible. With that, let's get on with the show. Seth Lerer is Distinguished Professor of Literature at the University of California, San Diego. He is the author of 9 previous books and received the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Truman Capote Prize in Criticism for Children's Literature, A Reader's History from Aesop to Harry Potter. Ladies and gentlemen, listen to a great conversation here. Seth and Julian, enjoy.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you to Warwick's and all of the partners of this wonderful process. And thank you to Julian Barnes for zooming in with us today for a conversation about his new book, Elizabeth Finch. I'm going to say a few words about Julian and then lead into our discussion. I think few writers today have had the range and impact that he's had. Evocative works of fiction, from Flaubert's Parrot to the Man Booker Prize winning Sense of an Ending, historical portraits, notably the French physician Samuel Jean Pozzi, The Man in the Red Coat, a remarkable work of historical reimagination, and a set of memoirs that in so many ways stretch the boundaries of autobiography. He's done so many things. He's been a book and media critic. He's been a lexicographer at the Oxford English Dictionary. He's been a public advocate for libraries and literacy. And today we're going to discuss his new book that is newly published in the United States, Elizabeth Finch. Now, I don't want to give anything away. I don't want to spoil the plot, but I want to say that, suffice it to say, this is a story of a charismatic teacher and a scholar. It's a reflection on the nature of love and loyalty. It's an inquiry into history, and it is, like so many of his books, really a meditation on loss. Not just loss of an individual, but I think the sense that in our time, we're really living in a culture of loss. I've always thought that the real genre for our time is elegy and memoir. And there's so much about this book, together with The Sense of an Ending, I think, that speaks to our cultural sensibility. Now, Elizabeth Finch is an unusual book in that it's not a traditional novel, but really it's built up as a narrative of reminiscence that is scaffolded, if you like, by aphorism, by maxim, by short quotations, sometimes in the voice or the pen of the fictional heroine, and sometimes in the voice of the narrator. And I thought one way of beginning our conversation would be for me to select a maxim or aphorism from the book and use that as the springboard for a series of questions. So the way that I'll do this for the first half or so is I'll offer a passage from the book and then use that as a way of opening discussion. And the passage that I would like to begin with occurs early in the book when we see the statement, whenever you see a character in a novel, let alone a biography or a history book, reduced and neatened into 3 adjectives, always distrust that description. And I think of this is Writing Workshop 101. It's Reading 101. And Julian, I'm going to invite you to riff, as it were, if you'd like, on this statement.
It's something that has struck me over the years, especially in biography, which attempts to have the full resonance of fiction, but often fails. I say that in the nicest possible way. Some of my best friends are biographers, but there are various tricks and tropes that biographers fall into. One is the use of that ridiculous tense, the past conditional or the future conditional. Surely at this point he must have been aware that, and you can hear there's no evidence for this statement. I'm just bluffing because I can't back it up, but this is my private guess. On the other hand, what the best biographers write is the sentence beginning, "We cannot know." I think that's always a powerful statement of integrity on the part of a biographer or a historian, for that matter. There are many things we cannot know. And that's where the novel sometimes has an advantage, in that it can imagine what we cannot know and present it as real fact. As for the 3, another of my pet hates is the, what should we say? We won't say Napoleon because he's quite well known, but Napoleon's valet was a short, scrawny, humorous man from Avignon, something like that. And you think that, 1 won't be enough, 4 is too many, 2 is okay, 3 is, and it's partly because, writing and music often goes in 3s. It's often a natural form, and often in the past, my books have been divided into 3 sections. In fact, I suppose this one is. It's probably, yes, indeed. It says 1, then 2, then 3.
Great,
I always
yes.
forget. But there's a natural rhythm to the 1, 2, and 3, and so sometimes biographers are drawn into this sort of easy and musical and extremely plausible way of describing a character. But you or I and everyone listening to this would probably hate it if we could be summed up in 3 adjectives.
Yes.
It would be a kind of insult, wouldn't it? It would be, say, oh, you're not as complicated as you think you are, but I've only got this amount of space for you in my book or in my conversation, and you are A, B, and C. Whereas in fact, we're all A to Z and then back through the alphabet in reverse order on different days.
See, I blame Francis Bacon for this, because all of Bacon's essays are 3. Some books are to be digested, some books are to be tasted, some books are to be swallowed. Everything is in 3s in that sort of great Renaissance rhetorical world. Yes,
that's right. And then, but that you can somehow buy into a bit more than these. That's a rhetorical device, yes, but it's probably conveying more truth than, short, fat, and oily, say.
That's true, yes, or nasty, British, and short. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
That's absolutely right. And I think what's wonderful about opening this conversation is that we're talking about the way in which a biographer will describe or characterize an individual, but I think that's really the challenge of being a teacher as well. And this is a book about a teacher. And as a teacher, the challenge, of course, is to walk in a limited amount of time, come up with the most memorable moments, or the most clear and almost note-takeable ways. And there was a moment early on in the book when I was watching Elizabeth teach, and the student asks for help or something, and Elizabeth says, in this wonderful quotation, "I am not employed to help you. I am here to assist you to think and argue and develop minds of your own." And I just underlined that, and I thought that is, and I would invite you then, since we've begun by talking a little bit about biographers, about teachers and the sort of the pedagogical impulse of this book. So many of your books really are teaching books, and I'm wondering if you could talk about this idea of what we're employed to do as teachers and what it is, what is our responsibility to our students.
I come from a longish, that's to say 3-generation line of teachers, from a great-grandfather who was a sort of village school headmaster to grandparents who taught in technical colleges and so on, to my father and mother who met while they were teachers. They were teachers of foreign language, French. And my brother who is a distinguished philosopher, an ancient philosopher, I like to say, so that you can take the phrase both ways. He's taught in universities all his life. I think I have a natural resistance to that, and I taught once for a year in France as part of my undergraduate career, and I taught a semester at Hopkins about 25 years ago when I was teaching creative writing. And I enjoyed all that, partly because I didn't really have much responsibility. I didn't have to grade papers and stuff like that. I think one of the things I learnt from teaching at Hopkins was I had, my graduate class was about 9 or 10, and they were all, what surprised me at first was how they were all very distinctive. They were all very distinctive in the way they wrote. Even if they're imitating someone, they were imitating someone in a particular way, which was particular to them. And this was a great pleasure to me and a surprise. But at the same time, I realized that, as Elizabeth Finch says, I wouldn't necessarily be the best teacher for all of them. This would be unnatural if I were. And I knew that I would be a better teacher for some than others. I mean, there was a very nice young man who kept writing, he wrote nothing but Gen X stories. Now, I'm not an expert on the genre, and so I didn't think I was particularly helpful to him. So you have to understand your limitations from the get-go, it seems to me. I've never thought, I'm interested that you think I'm a teacher as a writer. I don't think of myself like that. I don't think of myself in an ex cathedra position, speaking from a chair at a certain height above, the listeners. My image of myself as a novelist and as a journalist, no, more as a novelist. My image of myself as a novelist is that I'm sitting side by side with the reader on, say, a pavement cafe, and we're both looking out in the same direction, and the things going on the other side of the street, and I'm saying to the reader, what do you think they're up to? Do you think they're getting on? Do you think they're about to have a quarrel, are they? Do you think they're married? Do you think they're not married? And so on. And because that's the way you talk about, that's the way you gossip as a watcher of the passing parade of life. And the novel is in some ways a form of posh gossip, it seems to me. It's talking about the intimacies of people's lives, even if they're people who don't exist. And I have a natural antipathy to the didactic in novelists. I don't want to be told what to do, what to think, how to approach the world. I don't go to a novel for that. And so there are certain writers who, even though they're brilliant, I find antipathetic, like D.H. Lawrence, who is kind of always hitting me over the head with, this is the way, you're not living fully enough. Listen to the burning fires within yourself and obey them, sort of stuff. And I just think, no, I think I have a gin and tonic at this stage. And so, on the other hand, I want what is in my novel to be of interest. And I want readers, and I expect readers to take away different things from it. You're putting, as a novelist, you're putting there a sort of crafted object, which is as good as you can make it, and which the readers will examine in their different ways, and they'll take it apart, or they'll find it doesn't unlock, or whatever. You know, the hope. I remember John Cheever being interviewed on BBC television. It's one of the very few interviews he gave. Your great American short story writer, John Cheever, not as read as much as he should be. And he said the first canon of aesthetics is interest. Mm-hmm. And I thought, yeah, it is. You know, if you're not interested in the subject as a writer, the reader isn't going to be interested in what you're writing about. But if you're interested in it and can convey it, then you will interest readers who aren't naturally interested in the subject. I remember opening with some wariness that wonderful book called A River Runs Through It by Norman MacLean. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, I have no interest in fish or in fishing. I'm interested in the fishmongers and what they sell, but I don't want to wade into a river or go out in a boat and catch a marlin. Thank you very much. I'll leave that to Hemingway. And so, but when I read this, because it was described with passion and precision, I thought, oh, this is really exciting, you know? And you feel the water, and you feel the currents, and you feel the tug on the line, and you just get carried away by it. And I thought it was a wonderful book. And it's always very gratifying as a reader when you find a book which is not in the area you think, you know, we often read in our comfort zones too easily, and sometimes I think we should go into a bookshop and close our eyes and then put out your hand, and someone comes along and puts a book into it. And, you know, some of those won't work, but there might be some good discoveries that way.
But you see, I think you've described great teaching. Great teaching is not ex cathedra lecturing, even though we've all been in that situation. Great teaching is asking the provocative question. It is, you know, sort of creating the impression that you are sitting with the student, observing the world in so many ways. And I think you're absolutely right about interest. There's a wonderful line. When my son was born, my mother gave us Dr. Benjamin Spock's Baby in Childcare, which is, as you know, a classic of child rearing. And he has this wonderful chapter called What is School For? And he says the purpose of school is not to teach anything. Content is secondary. It's to socialize and engage. It is to make the world seem interesting and real. And I think that is as much a statement about great teaching as it is a statement about great novelistic writing. Yes. And that's why if you see what I'm getting at, that's why I see the pedagogical so much.
Yes.
In this kind of writing.
Okay. Well, we'll slightly part company on that one. But
it's fine with me.
I see where you're coming from.
I am going to give you another quotation, which also resonated so strongly with me. And I quote, "I've often puzzled over the relationship between men and women," which to me is one of the great understatements in English literature. And certainly I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and I said, you know, I don't know a lot about women. And he said, but? And I said, no, but I just don't know a lot about women. So I've puzzled over this. This is a book that is so much about men and women in unexpected kinds of ways. And I'm wondering, since so many of my undergraduates read books for not just relationships between men and women, but ideals of gender today. This is the conversation, as you know.
Yes.
I'm wondering where that is in this book, and how, you know, in so many ways, it's a book about the relationship between men and women. And maybe our narrator, Neil, you know, knows more than he thinks he does.
It is a kind of love story. I mean, the novelist's two great themes are love and death, and both the main characters in this novel die, Elizabeth Finch and Julian the Apostate. It's about a love which is not declared. It's not platonic, because that implies sort of high-minded and idealistic. I think this is a normal sort of love which the student in his 30s, Neil, who's the narrator, feels for the charismatic Elizabeth Finch, who is maybe 10 years older than him, maybe a bit more. And it's as he writes about her, it's a kind of love letter to her. But of course, she doesn't reply because he never asks the question. And so I think there are many different forms of love and its expression, and it's the way it's felt. And there are some forms which are not fully understood. Well, many forms which are not fully understood by the lover, him or herself. So I keep going back to that. I mean,
Yes.
I think some of the greatest writers are. My favorite Russian writer, for example, is Turgenev, who I think is the writer who understood love and the sort of, especially in its sort of hopelessness and embarrassment and blunderingness. He's so good at that, Turgenev.
Can I just pick up
Yes.
the thread of Julian the Apostate, who you've
Yes.
mentioned, that for readers of this book, it will come perhaps as a surprise that so much of the book is devoted to this late antique Roman imperial figure who seems to reject Christianity in favor of return to paganism or to older Roman traditions. And I have two questions really about Julian the Apostate. And one is, what is there about this historical character that was so fascinating, so compelling to you? And then the second is, of course, an obvious question, which is, he's the other Julian in the book.
It's pure coincidence that he
Is
has
it?
my name.
Oh.
Yes, and I certainly wasn't named after him by my parents.
No,
That
no,
would have been-
I'm sure
that
you
would
were
have
named
been-
after Julian
That would
the
be eerie if that was the thing. I don't know who I was named after, but well, he is, as you know, the last pagan emperor of Rome, killed in the Persian desert in 363, when he, the rules for the Romans and should be never going to Persia, just as the rules for all the Western powers should be never going to Afghanistan. I remember I have a very close American friend when the Americans were going in, and I said, "Look, don't do it." He said, "It's okay, it's easy. It's okay, we're military incredibly powerful." I said, "Yes, you are, but the British went in 3 times in the 19th century to Afghanistan, and each time they were defeated by the Afghans.
That's right.
And then the Russians went in, and they were defeated. So just don't try it," I said. Anyway, he didn't take my advice, and then nor did the American military for that point. Anyway, so Julian the Apostate, the last pagan emperor of Rome, had been emperor for 18 months, and he hadn't cancelled Christianity. He was permissive towards Christianity, but he reinstituted the pagan gods. And it's an interesting matter to consider. If he had lived for 30 years and been an emperor for 30 years, whether he would have turned back the tide of Christianity. I first came across him about 10 years ago. I was doing a radio program about British artistic and literary exiles in France in the end of the 19th, start of the 20th century. And there were quite a lot of them, painters and writers, from Oscar Wilde to Walter Sickert, and so on. And one of them was, because they found it more a congenial place than the straight-laced societies of Dublin or London and so on. One of these exiles was the poet Algernon Swinburne. And he wrote a poem in which contains the line, "Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean." Now, the pale Galilean is Jesus Christ. And these are supposed to be the last words of Julian the Apostate, as he is struck by a Persian lance, which strikes his arm and then his chest. He is then said to have taken a handful of blood into his palm, thrown it in the air and cried, "Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean." Well, like many of the great quotations, this is an invention, of course. It was made up, I don't know, 50 or 100 years later. and it's quite possible that he was carried on his shield to his tent where he died. But it is taken by Swinburne as others and others, because Julian the Apostate has a long afterlife, which I'd like us to talk about, as the moment at which Christianity was successful on both a military and a theological basis. And after Julian, there were no more pagan Roman emperors, only Christians. And Swinburne viewed this as a disastrous turning point for Western civilization. Under the old dispensation of Rome, Greece and Rome, there were multiple gods. It was a pick and mix style of worship. Some worked for you, some didn't work for you. And they were always very tolerant towards the gods of those they conquered. And when the Romans conquered Gaul and then Germany, they didn't impose their gods on the local people. They said, you can have your gods, keep them. If you want to worship ours, that's cool. But in terms of theology, there was no big deal about being invaded and being occupied. But what happens, they were polytheistic, and this book is in part in praise of polytheism. Trouble with monotheisms like Christianity, Islam, and so on, is that they often start in a kind of violent takeover of other religions. They often extremely violent. Schismatics are put to death. Apostates are found everywhere, as they are in our day, all too recently. And then they become institutionalized, and then they become oppressive. One of the things that struck me most about going into the early Christian church was how incredibly violent the Christians were and how incredibly destructive. We think, I was brought up to think, oh, well, yes, Rome, they put all these Christians in the Colosseum, and then they sort of let tigers loose on them and that sort of thing. But the far greater danger, by a factor of about 300-1 to an early Christian, was another Christian who didn't quite believe what he or she believed. And so they were, Julian the Apostate said, he released one sect, the Arians, from exile, because he said, if you put lots of different Christians together, they fight like rats in a sack. This is what they were known for. They were also incredibly destructive. 98 to 99% of Greek and Roman texts just disappeared. It was mainly in the 4th and 5th century, and St. Augustine referred to it as, let me find the phrase because it's a classic. Well, first of all, when he was preaching in Carthage, he says, all superstition of pagans and heathens should be annihilated. That's what God wants, God commands, God proclaims. And he referred to it by the pious paradox of merciful savagery. As a result of which, greatest library in the ancient world, 700,000 manuscripts, was burnt to the ground. Temples were razed, paintings were destroyed, and so on and so on and so on. It's interesting that the first people to attack the Parthenon were the Christians, who hacked to the heads of the gods of it, and so on. So when you have that as a background, you think maybe there's something to be said for polytheism, for the old paganism, as well as the fact that, as Julian the Apostate saw it, and he wrote a very interesting tract called Against the Galileans, He called the Christians Galileans because it was a sort of snooty way of implying they were just from a village. You know, they're just local villagers, hobos, not real people. He was sort of not surprisingly snobbish about Christianity. Was that the other thing is that the old paganism, as Swinburne and Julian the Apostate said, was a religion of light and joy. And then this was all we had, this dispensation during our lifetime. And then after that, we go to darkness and we know not what. Whereas Christianity introduced the idea that of darkness and sin and pain in the world up till death. And then if you were lucky and you behaved yourself, you got the peace and light and pleasure afterwards. So an entirely different mental and theological shift. And I think it's quite legitimate to say, well, actually, you know, maybe one is better than the other.
Well, yes, it's fascinating because there is a religious, or let me just say, there is a thread about belief and religious identity running through the book. And not only the arguments against monotheism, but I think this whole question of whether our main character is or comes from a Jewish family is, there's this wonderful moment when I think late in the book said Elizabeth Finch was her real name, Jessica Finkelstein. I actually went to high school with Jessica Finkelstein. So it just sort of hit me immediately. And of course, one of the things that the book speaks to, and I'm coming to this, as someone who's, read a lot of Sebald and a lot of sort of post-Holocaust literature, is this whole question of what it means to take on a certain identity or to pass, or, what the unique relationship is between Jewish identity in the 20th and 21st century, and also British identity. And I don't want to give anything away, and I don't want you to, to tell us, maybe solve the riddle for it, but it's enigma in the book. And
yes,
and my question is, what is the novelistic function of that enigma? What is the energy? What's the work that it does for us? Why do we need that here? Well,
because that's how life is. And one of the ironies of the quest that Neil, the narrator, sets off in his attempt to discover everything that he didn't know about Elizabeth Finch. And she has a brother. And he's always assumed that she was Jewish. Without, anything more than sort of rough sociological prejudices that she must be somehow. And then she he meets her brother after she's dead, and he says, I mean, she was Jewish, wasn't she? And the brother says, good Lord, no. Where did you get that idea from? Jewish? You want me to drop my trousers? He says in a very English way, and so that is sort of set up as it's set up first as a sort of tease, and then as an insoluble, because he can't know the answer to it. And so that's one of the things that happens, that the more you investigate, the more you also find mysteries and enigmas about people which are insoluble. And you just have to hold your hands up and say, well, I don't know the answer to that. But I would guess that the sort of cultural approach to things that she has, and the sort of the high culture, the absolute lack of interest in anything, as banal as, say, sport or crossword puzzles or something like that. And her high seriousness and her moral rigor might incline us to think that she was Jewish. It doesn't matter in a way. It's another one of those things that the reader can decide in his or her own way. I mean, again, I'm sitting next at the cafe table. Do you think she's Jewish? This woman walks past.
Well, my Jadar was certainly alerted in the course of it, if you know about Jadar. that, the Jewish radar, that sensitive.
It's called Jadar. Yes.
It's
Yes.
Jadar. Yes, that's my sense here, and I sort of wanted her to be in so many ways, but what I also wanted her to be was a character that was resonant with the woman in the sense of an ending. Because if I could just ask, one of the things that I think is happening in both books is that you have a male figure who is the unwitting beneficiary or inheritor of a woman's estate, or part of a woman's estate. And I may be making a connection that may be coincidental, but I'm wondering if this was something that, as you are writing, puts these two books in dialogue.
No, I never do that. I never think of, I mean, I've written quite a lot of books now, but I never think of them as that awful word, an for it. I think of this one damn book after another. And I know when writing, I never think, oh yes, this is, I've been here before, but now I'm going to do it again in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
I just think about the task in hand. I'd approach the question in a slightly different way, which is that in one of my books, one of my recent books, but you probably know them better than I do at the moment. There's a man who makes a distinction, or there's someone who makes a distinction between women of mystery and women of clarity. And says, some men want one and some men want the other. And in a strange way, Elizabeth Finch is both a woman of exceptional clarity in the way she talks and behaves, and yet also a woman of mystery. Mm-hmm. So I sort of have put the two versions of potential female type. Mm-hmm. And mix them up together.
Yes, I can see that, and I can sense that, in so many ways, it's that blend of mystery and clarity. I mean, there's another quotation towards the end which I think really bears on this, and this is the phrase, "Don't chase that missed love, that half-forgotten love, that misunderstood love years later. If it went wrong the first time, it'll go wrong the second time." And that really hit me, because I actually disagree with that. I think that's the whole, at a certain point in life, you think that, or you sustain yourself in thinking that if it went wrong the first time, it won't go wrong the second time, or the idea that this is what the imagination is about. I just want to contest this and ask if that's, I'm trying to say is this a maxim? Is this sort of another one of those moments when
the author is speaking? No, yes. It's not a moment when the author is speaking. I mean, I often make statements like that, not knowing the answer myself and not knowing which is better. Mm-hmm. I mean, some people say never, don't go back, and other people say if the fire is still burning, try. I don't think when it comes to love, there are almost any general rules that you can make. And we are twitched this way and that by the whip crack of DNA and the sort of strange pressures of society and family and friends and so on. Mm-hmm. And we can think we're behaving in the most clear, rational, and yet deeply emotional fashion, and we're just deluding ourselves. Mm-hmm. We're very good at deluding ourselves, so it's an example of something that I put into the book as a clear statement, while not knowing whether I believe it or not.
Right, of course.
I mean, Tom Stoppard once made a film for television which was called Tom Stoppard Doesn't Know, and he illustrated it by he was in a car and he was driving past through a village, and all of a sudden a man came out to his gate with a chicken under his arm. And then there are sort of further elaborations. And, you know, as a writer or as a dramatist, you're struck by the man with the chicken under his arm, but you can't explain it. You know, Tom Stoppard does not know why this man has a chicken under his arm. And he writes a play to find out, you know. It's often that's often things like that that start you off as a writer. I find.
Right. I think that, you know, there is so much, as you say, that he's universalizing about this book, about love, about knowledge. But as I read and reread it, here's my question. In many ways, it's a very English book. There is a certain kind of London civic and intellectual life. There is an incident with the London Review of Books, which I thought was just marvelous. There's this, you know, characterization of the LRB as this sort of a wonderfully out of touch left-wing thing. I remember years ago when the London Review of Books published something that was particularly anti-American, and there was a fantastic letter to the editor, which read in its entirety, "Dear sirs, remind me next time I'm in London to shove your loony leftist faces in some dog shit." And I thought that was the ultimate letter, right? But I guess, again, so what I'm asking is that for American readers, since we are celebrating the American publication, what is there about the book that you would like an American to see, or that you think transcends or goes beyond the local London and British texture of the book?
Well, in this book, two-thirds of it is set in London, and one-third of it is set in the late Roman Empire. So it's not as parochial as you make it sound. I've written books in recent years.
I didn't mean parochial. But I did mean, you know, texture.
It sounded as if you were saying parochial.
Well, that's my gift.
I
to
think
be misunderstood in this way. Yes,
I've written books about late 19th century France, Stalinist persecution of Shostakovich, and I sort of range into the past as well as geographically, and I don't think any differently of this novel. I think it has as general an application as any of my other books, and you know, I think if the American reader comes to it with that key requisite of interest, then I hope, you know, readers are good at, you know, jumping across the Atlantic if it's interesting.
Yes,
you know,
I agree.
I mean, that's what reading is. It's about finding out about people who aren't you, and all their wonderful differences, so, you know, and as I said at the beginning, it's about love and death and what is more serious.
Absolutely. So do you think then, just as we wrap up our conversation before we turn to audience Q&A, it's not just finding people who are different from you, but changing you? I mean, I'm certainly changed by this book. I appreciate the conversation, you know, and certainly, you know, the sense that I have in our conversation is that we're supposed to be different after we have finished a book in some way.
Yes, though I certainly wouldn't want to specify
how
or in what way, because every reader's takeaway will be different from the same book. I mean, there are very few books, except, you know, famous tracts or manifestos or whatever, where it's clear what the writer wants you to conclude. I quite like my books ending with a sort of, in an emotional, moral sense, the sense that it ends with ...
Right.
and the characters are walking off to a different future which you can imagine. So you know, one of Flaubert's maxims was "ne pas conclure," don't come to conclusions. That's the easy way for a novelist, is to come to conclusions about life and present them to the reader and say, these are my conclusions. I don't want lectures at the end of my novels, like at the end of War and Peace, you get a huge lecture on history. I don't want that. I don't lecture. My readers are my friends, not my subjects.
Very well put. And one of our friendly readers has a Q&A which will no doubt be familiar to you, which is about the inspiration behind Elizabeth Finch herself, and the sense that, as many reviewers in the UK raised, of the relationship between her and the late Anita Bruckner. Would you be comfortable talking about that?
I'm quite comfortable talking about it. I mean, one of the things is that when you create a memorable character, you find that people, especially reviewers, think, oh, it must be based on someone real. So I've been told that that Elizabeth Finch is based on Muriel Spark, Anita Bruckner, my late wife, my current partner, and myself, which covers a pretty broad field.
Well, Madame Bovary, c'est moi, right?
That was, yes, and that was a joke too from Flaubert. And we don't know whether he actually said it. It's very interesting. That's one of those famous things which disappear into the mists of time as you try and investigate. It wasn't even quoted about him until after his death, so we don't know where it comes. I certainly, when I was starting off, was thinking about a woman of, as I've said before, sort of moral and intellectual rigor. And I thought of someone like Anita Bruckner. I use a phrase of hers. It's quite interesting, and I think this is where the misidentification was made. I was once having lunch with her, and I wrote about this in a newspaper article, and she leant across. She's a wonderful woman. She's incredibly intelligent, large eyes. She never seemed to blink. And she looked across what I was eating, and she said, "How is that? Disappointing?" With a wonderfully excited edge, the hope that disappointment would hit the lunch table. And I used that as I put that into the words for the mouth of Elizabeth Finch. But then, as Elizabeth Finch's novel, you put something in, not just because, oh, you think that's a good line. You put it in because you then reuse it. It then comes in twice more into the book in different circumstances, and it's changed on each occasion. And so that's what you try to do. I don't, you know, her intellectual interests, Elizabeth Finch's, are quite different from Anita Bruckner's. I know Elizabeth Finch much better than I knew Anita Bruckner. She was very good at keeping you at a distance. I think the best way I can explain it is, I once saw an interview with the British actor Dirk Bogarde, and he was asked, how do you build a character? How do you build a character when you're acting? And he said, I start with the shoes. And I thought that was very interesting. You start with shoes, and then you build upwards. And I could say what I did was I took a pair of Anita Bruckner shoes and I inserted Elizabeth Finch into them, and then she walked off in her own direction. That's the connection.
That's wonderful. We have two audience questions, one of which seems sublime and the other ridiculous.
Oh, let's have both of them.
So the sublime one is, in Flaubert's Parrot, you say, quote, I ban coincidences if I were a dictator of fiction. And so they're asking you to describe how this moves our characters beyond our own sense of agency.
I've always been against coincidence in novels. It seems, I mean, it's a great Victorian ploy, you know, all of a sudden X turns up and brings things to a happy conclusion. You know, there's a no deus ex machina in life, I find, so there shouldn't be in literature. And in the same way, if you don't know how to advance the plot and you think, oh, well, I'll have them meet on a train, or they can both reach for the same newspaper in a shop or whatever.
Right.
I think lazy. And so this is a series of instructions about fiction, which the narrator, one Geoffrey Braithwaite, has, and he's rather sort of grumpy old bastard. Not at all like me. This was written a long time ago. Anyway, you know, that 12-volume sequence by the British writer Anthony Powell called Dance to the Music of Time is riddled with coincidences. You know, the old brigadier runs into his colonel in White's club or whatever. Oh, I haven't seen you for a while. What have you been up to? And then they say, I just sort of have an instinctive dislike of coincidence.
Yes.
I mean, I think I was reading a novel not long ago by an English writer, and it had some coincidences in it, rather absurd. But then he wrote into it a defense that Henry James wrote of coincidences in fiction. And I thought, that makes it worse, not better.
Well, that's good. Well, what may be our last question reminds me of a moment in an early Monty Python sketch when they have Lenin, Mao, and Khrushchev and Fidel Castro sitting around a panel discussing issues, and Eric Idle, the panelist, says, this one to Vladimir Lenin, who won the FA Cup in 1958. And here's the question, who is the greatest, Federer, Djokovic, or Williams?
Very tricky. And it's interesting what they might each say. I mean, it's clear that Serena Williams is the greatest female tennis player ever. And I think, and Djokovic would agree, that Federer is the greatest male tennis player ever. I've revered Federer in a way that I've revered few, you know, as a very poor tennis player myself, is the way I've revered very few sports people. He has, one of the things about him is he has none of that sort of strutting male bullshit that goes with top end male players. You know, it's all about, it seems to me, he's about grace, not virility. And, you know, Williams is just a phenomenon. I would like to have seen Venus win a few more than she did, but you can't argue that she's the greatest ever. You know, when I think she's got one Grand Slam fewer than Margaret Court, but Margaret Court in her day, you know, would win the Australian Open playing against 6 or 8 other Australians, because no one went over to the Australian Open, so it didn't really count. It's like saying, you know, who's the greatest novelist? I think you just have to enjoy them all.
Well, I think our questioner knows more about you then, and then he let on. I think that you follow tennis, that you see them. I mean, can we just wrap up? I mean, what you said about Federer was so resonant. Is this, you know, about strutting male bullshit? I mean,
yes, I don't go for that.
I know you have no patience for it, right?
I have no patience with it. No. I also love the fact that when he won his first Grand Slam, his village in Switzerland gave him a cow. And I often wonder, A, what happened to the cow, and sure, B, whether he's now got, you know, 20 cows. They've got a herd of cows for each Grand Slam.
I would think that Tom Stoppard might have something to say about that.
Yes. And the other thing I love about him is the fact that he's had 2 sets of twins, set of boy twins and a set of girl twins. And then my fantasy, I imagine, you know, in about 10 or 15 years' time, the Wimbledon mixed doubles final.
That's it. Would be the
they say Federer and Miss Federer against Federer and Miss Federer, and it would be an umpire's nightmare.
That's
but I don't know if they've inherited the Federer genes.
Well, we will find.
They may just want to milk the cows. Who knows?
There you go. Or that's right. Well, this has been a remarkable conversation. I know that we've all appreciated this. I think Julie Slavinsky is going to come on now. Again, Julie.
Thank you so much. I was sitting in the background, enjoying every word of this.
How did we do?
You did great. And one thing I love that you, Seth, that you picked out the just little passages. And I have to read you, Julian, my favorite, because it just stopped me short when you said, imagine science unhindered by religion.
There we go.
That was just one of those where it stopped me dead.
Well, wonderful. Well,
Love it.
thank you so much, Julie.
And I want also, so I think, Julian, one of the things that you said in the green room was you sometimes end an answer to a question with an electric typewriter. And I don't know if anybody's been watching, but your electric typewriter is behind your left shoulder. So just wanted people to make.
It just is. It's an IBM 196C, which one of the greatest typewriters ever made. And you can't get them. It's very hard to get spares. And I've written on that for 30 years and more. And it's one of America's greatest inventions.
Love it. Julian, thank you so much for your time. Seth, thank you for this interview.
Oh, it's been a delight. Really great pleasure.
I'd like to thank Knopf. I understand that this is, Julian, your first American Zoom. So we are honored that you joined us here today for lunch hour.
Yes, well, you can see it's getting dark behind me. It's now virtually night time here. And
a late dinner for you.
Way past my supper time. Yes.
All right.
I'm going to have a large glass of wine now to start with. Thank you for your company. Thank you, Seth, for your questions.
It's a delight. Thank you.
Thank you all. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.